Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. This show we talk about the impact that street gangs have had on youth and communities in this country. We will also explore how strategies by law enforcement, how effective they have been in combating gang violence. Our guest this week has a personal understanding of gang life because he was a former gang member. Today he is a professor at New Mexico State University in the criminology department. Dr. Robert Duran, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moreno.
You recently wrote a book entitled Gang Life in Two Cities, An Insider's Journey. What was it really that inspired you to write that book?
Yeah, I think a lot of the book, it just kind of began from my own experiences kind of growing up in Utah and moving around a couple different places, but pretty much starting off from, Utah's not seen as a place where gang activity is present, but growing up and going to high school, that was a big influence on a lot of us, just about the group to fit in and, who we associated with was just kind of on a friendship basis. But then it got to a point of, you can only be friends and hang around so long, and then eventually got pressured to become part of a gang. So pretty much the journey kind of started of, once it got time to where, the period of where I was in gangs, I wasn't thinking about writing a book or going on to college or doing anything like that. I was pretty much trying to, figure out ways to stay out of prison and, not get killed or, get involved in anything that hurts someone else too, because things would happen. But it was kind of later on when I started going to college that I got to a point of, what explains, my neighborhood and what's going on. And I took a sociology class, which was really interesting, and they were talking about statistics and numbers and about life chances and where you're expected to be. And so when I started taking that college class, it was kind of like an eye-opener of, I'm expected to fail. And why is it that I'm expected to fail? And my friends and family, what explains our trajectories in life where people on the other side of the neighborhood, they go off to college and become doctors and lawyers, and why are my friends going to prison and not having those same outcomes?
What was it, you've had over 20 years contact with gangs. Were gangs just someone that you looked up to in the community, or were they just, a vital part of the community?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you know my family, they're not a gang family. They're big family pride, religion, respect, work hard, good values. So my involvement was kind of different than a lot of my family members because they weren't going that way. The gang itself is kind of like, when I left to go outside my door and go to school, I didn't have my brothers or anyone to protect me. It was kind of like I'm on my own, and boxing was a big thing in my family, but as an individual level, but we were encountering stuff that on a group level I think was bigger. So the gangs where I was at was just kind of, friendship, who's going to look out for you, and really the perception of what it was going to be was a lot different than when you actually join. But the perception in the beginning was just a cool thing, positive, but not what it ended up being.
From your experience and research, do gangs offer a sort of structure for youth that may be growing up in similar circumstances as you did?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that, the gangs are meeting a niche in the community. They're I look at this whole idea of like oppression and generations of exclusion. So, these institutions where school, politics, they're not addressing all the needs of everyone in the community. It's hitting a particular segment, which is usually the middle to upper class. But what about the lower economic groups? And so gangs, it wasn't the police that were going to come in and save if you got beat up or hurt. It wasn't the police that were going to come and save you. It was going to be your friends that were going to be there to look out for you. So the way it kind of began was just kind of around that influence of who's your friends, who has your back, who looks out for you. It wasn't on rivalries with different people. It was just who's going to look out for you.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done and been doing for these past years. You focused on 2 cities in Denver and also in Ogden, Utah. What were some of the similarities and what were some of the differences in gang activity or gang life in those cities?
Yeah, so Ogden was where I began, and that's where I wanted to do most of my research. But when I got to graduate school at University of Colorado, my advisor was like, you need to have a local setting. You can't just be going off to Utah and doing ethnography and doing interviews. You need to be able to have a local setting so you can get in the scene. And so when I was looking around at places, Denver seemed like the most best choice because of the history of gang activity. And they also had groups working with gang members, so I could find a way in, possibly better. But yeah, looking at both cities, the similarities and differences was, when I began, I was doing interviews and networking with both communities. They're going through a lot of the similar things, even though the size of the cities, their histories of activism and politics are a lot different, but the gangs and the reasons why they were there were very similar. I think probably the major difference was the level of activism that was present in Denver, Colorado, to kind of challenge the mainstream view of gangs and the Latino community of, their stereotype and second-class treatment was active in Denver, whereas in Utah, it's pretty much if you were silenced, and the Latino community's kind of, I believe, really oppressed in the state of Utah, and so active leaders or people in positions of power, don't have the same. They're not there. Whereas in Denver, at least there's that influence where, gangs and the reasons that led to gangs in the beginning are being challenged.
Now, exactly how are some of the challenges that are being made from gangs? Are they challenges from the outside or are they challenges from the inside?
Yeah, when I go back, because I did a whole historical view of putting together about, that was my whole question why I started school in the beginning. Why are there gangs and why is this happening to my friends, and why my family members experiencing kind of this generations of exclusion within the United States, that you think things would be better off when, third or fourth generation, but no, so what's kind of happening, and what was the question again?
I was just really trying to understand, you said in Denver there's a little more activism to challenge individuals from entering gang life, or challenging the stereotype of the traditional, mainstream media understanding of what gang life is. The mainstream media paints a sort of picture. Could you maybe start off with telling us about what type of picture the mainstream media paints as far as our general understanding of gang life or gang activity?
Yeah, the mainstream media picture and even law enforcement picture of gangs is they're violent, criminal organizations. By the time you join, like at 14, 15, you're already coming from generations of family members who've been involved in gangs. You're going to go off to prison, you're going to be involved in criminal activity. We need to lock these people up and keep them off our streets, that there's like no redemptive value. They're just kind of at the bottom of our society, and I think that's the main way in which they're portrayed, at least the way I grew up later on hearing, and then also encountering with a lot of my research and trying to challenge kind of those viewpoints.
Now, I was able to read some of the interviews that you had with gang members, both current and former gang members, and they mentioned very similar things, that they felt stuck, or just living day by day, or they seemed like that was how they felt. And I was wondering, is that how you felt growing up, and was that how, what were some of the things that in your research that you found seemed to have a positive influence on affecting youth from getting involved with gangs?
Yeah, so I think that perspective of, is there a future, for a lot of the people that I interviewed, especially at what point in their lives I was able to interview. So in Denver, when I worked with a group of ex-gang members working with current gang members, they were actively involved in the gang. They didn't see no alternative. So the goal of the program was to try and get these youngsters to start thinking about, what are the consequences, and it wasn't anti-gang, because we were all from the gangs too, and we had tattoos and some, had backgrounds, but it was to help the youth about a nonviolent approach and unity. So learning about your history and your culture and your people, and what's the problems that we're encountering. So learning about like the organizations of the Crusade for Justice that was around in the late 60s and early 70s that was challenging the schools and law enforcement for the negative treatment. And so I think a lot of where we were coming from was that generation of the whole civil rights movement had passed away, and gangs were able to be brought down in Denver, Colorado, by giving an alternative, a better alternative, where why you want to be in gangs, why you want to fight each other, let's get together, let's unite. That's not our problem. The person that looks just like you, going through the same things, that's not your enemy. So starting to look at, what are the reasons we're in this situation, and what ways can we challenge that? So a lot of us, there's a shift. If you look at gangs in my book historically, I start from 1940, pretty much in both communities, and even starting in Denver, looking at the Ku Klux Klan and how it started. And early 1920s, a major influence on the mainstream of, it wasn't even seen as a problem, but these are the kind of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Mormon religion that held that because you were darker skinned, you were part of this lost tribe, and you were less than, so their goal was to save you. So seeing about how gangs kind of historically started in the 1940s in Denver, and then starting in the 1970s in Ogden, but going through this whole kind of trajectory of time, I was able to see the different wars against gangs that were launched and the tactics that were used to try and bring gangs down, and the failures and the obstacles, and then the alternative coming in of the Crusade for Justice and civil rights movement that was making gangs fade away. But when COINTELPRO and law enforcement cracked down on the civil rights organizations, we don't want that. We don't want challenging the institutions that are, we don't want no one challenging the institutions that we're in control of. We like things the way they are, but when those were challenged, COINTELPRO and the aggressiveness towards those civil rights organizations, in their demise, gangs came back up again, and they came to a new level of which, again, it would go to, you fight against each other, you see each other as the enemy, you're not united. Now we got a new tool of criminal justice kind of oppression that we can lock more people up, and we can use it through the label of gangs. That because you're a gang member, we can target you a different way, we can be more aggressive. We don't need a reason to pull you over. You're a gang member. Put up your hands. What's in your pockets? Get the full pat downs. What's going on? Where are you going? What are you doing? So, that's legitimized that kind of war on people in our communities. And the thing that's kind of crazy about it is how gangs were started to help us, but then it's been a the biggest tool to kind of come down against not just gang members, but everybody who's part of those racial ethnic groups within those communities. So where it's targeting all Latino youth or all black youth, Asian youth who live there. And most of them aren't involved in gangs, but they're getting caught up in that same net.
Is the communities that you discussed, both in Colorado and Utah, you talk about the barrio communities. Do they have like they're both very similar in working communities, seem to be kind of near highly industrial areas. And I was wondering, do you feel that basically what you're coming at is that is there kind of like a manipulation of the haves against the have-nots?
Yeah, a lot of I think of it as, racism in the post-civil rights era. So racism now is supposed to be gone. That civil rights movement, legislation passed, all these laws, to try and remove. But now it's gone to a different form of, so the haves, the have-nots, is, you can see economic divide just in where people live. And so one thing I do with my research is I map communities. And so I've mapped Doña Ana County, and we know where do the whites live, where do the Latinos live? Do they have equal share of resources? Are they experiencing the same things? And I did that in Denver, Colorado, and Ogden, Utah. And so people can talk about, we're going through the same things, but you look at the communities and where people are starting off at, they're coming from different backgrounds and different worldviews of what's happening.
I want to talk a little bit about your experience with gangs, and when was it that you entered the gang, and what was that experience? Could you would you mind describing with us that experience and really what happened and how you entered into that life?
Yeah, that's why, I think this book is, like, if I wasn't here, if I would have got incarcerated, got locked up, caught up on something when I was younger, this book would never exist. So all the people I was able to interview and talk to they wouldn't talk to nobody else. Media come in or whatever, I had access to people who their stories, are not known. And the way they're usually told is by someone that's not from those communities, and they usually put it their own slant and put a negative view or hype, and there's a lot of sensationalism of gangs. So if I go back to, when I got involved with gangs, I was just a regular kid trying to fit in. I thought I was pretty tough. I learned through age that, no one's really that tough, but just kind of, I thought I was a certain way, had to be a certain way. And with time, just learned that it wasn't all that it was meant to be. And if you want to get a way out, first, I guess you got to see that a way out is possible. And, so from like 16 to 18, I was lost in the whole gang vibe and what it meant to be somebody. But then I think when a lot of stuff started going on with, a home invasion robbery done on me, one of my closest brother going to prison, friends going to prison, and myself also facing choices that could lead me to prison. It's like, there's got to be something different. But what is different? So I liked working on cars, so I wanted to open up my own lowrider shop. So that's pretty much what got me in college in the first place. It was not because I heard of sociology or statistics or racial oppression or inequality and what explains the situation we're in, but it was more of, I want to work on cars, open up my own lowrider shop one day, and this is the way I can maybe do that. And then in the meantime, I was exposed to these other ideas and then trained through classes and mentorship how to do research to capture what's going on in your community. And is it the same as what they write in the books, already, or is it different, and what's happening? So I kind of got hooked around later on and started really with a book by Malcolm X, and pretty much through his journey of finding, how could he be a leader and going to prison and being lost himself, but then finding, this greater need for human rights, for, for the experience that blacks were going through in the United States. And so I kind of hooked into that for the Latino side of the community and started learning more about my own family history, my own background, and what it means to even for me to be here and to be able to speak on my family's behalf.
You focused in your research a lot on the Latino communities and Mexican-American gangs. What were some of the findings that you found within the gangs that really kind of, I guess, had very big similarities between a regular family?
I guess for a family, it was, some of the gangs, they had family members involved, but it was pretty much we look out for each other. So if we walk outside here, you're my brother, I got a brother, Anthony, as I was mentioning, you step out here and someone beats you up, I'm going to be there to try and stop that from happening. You're my brother, we're family. So a lot of the gangs was the same way. We try and look out for each other, and that I can even think of like law enforcement or people looking at this. I'm not trying to promote gangs. I would never want to promote gangs, but look at the situation that a lot of our youth are in, and coming in with law enforcement, or you're going to be the big tough guys to fix everything. No, it's the people who are there and going through things that are going to try and handle and look out for each other. So I think a lot is the community and the gang. Originally, and what we started off to do was to provide physical protection for each other, but then also, people get bored, and there's a variety of different people within the gang. So even though, like you and I could be real cool, we could have someone else that's part of the group that's always getting in trouble. And no matter where we go, they're always getting in trouble. So we got to look out for that person too. And we tell them, hey, calm down, but still, when things happen, they can get out of hand very quickly. And so, alcohol, drugs can change a lot of things, of perception and people's emotions when they come together, especially rival groups, that things can escalate beyond your control, and then later on, you're thinking about it as like, what happened? What happened at that time, and how did it get to that point? And, what could we have done to prevent something like that? Because, there's a lot of people, still locked up, and people that I've interviewed and who are in the book that good friends. But they've made some decisions that, if they could have done it a different way, they would have liked to. But it was almost kind of like this whole path of all of us from the neighborhood. We were on a path of failure. And nowadays, they're not all in prison, and a lot of them have gone on. They have families and lead regular lives, and a lot of them you wouldn't even know they were in gangs.
I see.
Regular people raising their family and doing the best that they can. A few of them are rappers, and so it's cool to see. All of them. It's not just a negative outcome.
Yeah. We only have a couple minutes left, but I'd like to hear about the former members who you spoke with, about how maybe they were in prison and were readjusting to society. What were some of the challenges that they were facing trying to stay on a positive track?
Yeah, I think you get caught up in that system, and I think that's where a lot of the gangs started to divide, was those that went to prison and then those that were able to stay outside, because those that went to prison were pushed more into that survival and more stigma. You know, the gang got pushed into other ways through prison. So when they come out, now they have felonies, now they have prison record, harder to get jobs. So, you know, what is there? What options? Can I go to school? And I've tried to help too, about helping my friends. You know, if you like automotives, what is there? If you like art, what's there? What is your potential? What is your interest? How can you bring that in out of people for them to pursue, you know, things the mainstream way? So you like rap, you know, what kind of things can help you so you don't get brought back into the gang stuff? But I think a lot of it is you just, you know, this system is, you know, people are failing, and, you know, so that generations of exclusion, you know, I'm kind of seeing is that I worry for my own kids and other neighborhoods. It's going to go long after me. So what can I do, and what can other, you know, ex-gang members, former gang members do to, and even cultural community activists, what can we do to stop this trajectory that some of us are on? And so I think the empowerment groups, cultural empowerment, learning your history, learning your background, education, you know, I think a lot of it can be learned there, but the institutions of education too, you know, in high school, middle school, they need to change. They need to be altered. That, you know, are kids happy and excited to go to school, or, you know, is it not meeting their needs? So I think even the stuff that's been going on in Arizona about, you know, targeting, you know, the Chicano programs that's been going on there, you know, that's something positive. And why do you want to ruin something that's, you know, helping these youth find purpose in life and find their identity and their history? But I think, you know, my whole argument in the racial oppression is, you know, I don't think mainstream society, they don't want to see us succeed. And so if we don't help ourselves and do what it takes and organize like they did in the civil rights movement, you know, there's going to be a lot more people going to prison, there's going to be a lot more body bags, there's people going to be dying, and we're going to be taking each other out. But it doesn't need to be that way. If we can find this unity, which has been in the past, you know, we can do it again. And, you know, with the groups that I worked at before, they're trying to make that happen.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. Robert, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Our guest was Robert Duran. He is a faculty member in the criminology department at New Mexico State University. Thank you for joining us for Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno.